All right, guys, Mr. Sherwin here, and today we're going to be talking about urban America. We've got massive immigration, we've got massive problems, and we've got massive growth. So, a little different than what we normally do. Normally, I give you the PowerPoint slides and you kind of jot things down off to the side. Today is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be fairly easy. I like to call them lazy notes. And what they are is basically you read along, and I'm going to try to highlight what's in red that kind of fills in the blanks for most of these notes. Some of these things we've already talked about. So if you see a big space on your actual sheet for lazy notes, what that means is there's probably some things there that I'm going to talk about that aren't in the lazy notes, and you should probably jot some things down. And at the end, there are, I don't know, 10 terms or so that are sort of, kind of, let's add these at the end, tack them on at the end, things that we need to talk about, but not really in great detail. Things like education and how that's going to be improved during this urbanization in America. So make sure you take down some additional notes there. But for the most part, you're going to just kind of read along with me as we go. And if it's in red, it more than likely goes in the blanks that you have. Okay. So we talk about industrial revolution, we talk about immigration, we talk about mass urbanization, and we're going to talk about problems associated with all those things. So, what causes all this is the Transcontinental Railroad, linking the East and the West Coast, and then that's going to cause mass immigration. So we talked about the Statue of Liberty and this poem at the bottom that says, "Bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Very welcoming for immigrants. And when it's interesting when they say refuse, they're saying, "Send me your trash." Other countries, we want to take them in America. So very welcoming for European immigrants. And of course, all this is at the base of the Statue of Liberty. And of course, when Europeans come, most of them are going to come from Eastern and South Europe. And this is mostly going to be made up of new immigrants. Of these particular immigrants, 14 million immigrants arrived between 1860 and 1900. Most of them are going to be European Jews. So they're already, you see that this is quite different than the structure of most American cities as far as ethnicity and culture and religion. So we're going to have some issues with having a lot of different immigrants coming into America. So the reasons why immigrants came, they came for employment. They came because there were very few immigration restrictions at the time. A lot of them came because they didn't want to be forcefully made to join the military in their home countries. Religious freedom was another one. And of course, the chance to move with the social ladder, the chance to live the American dream. Most immigrants came in what's known as steerage, the least expensive accommodations on a steamship. This is, if you've ever seen the movie Titanic, Jack is in the bowels of the ship. He brings nothing but a suitcase with him to America. This is how a lot of immigrants came to America. And of course, the name of this immigration center in New York is Ellis Island. And it was a very busy immigration point in New York for a period of about 50 years in New York Harbor. So here's a picture of Ellis Island, of course, in New York Harbor. Most immigrants are going to come to America. They're going to settle in cities. We're going to talk later about how cities grew not just because of immigrants, but also because of migrants, people in America, farmers who wanted to move to the big cities. So cities are going to grow tremendously. Most immigrants, when they came to America, they settled into their own ethnic groups or ethnic conclaves, or I'm sorry, not conclaves, ethnic enclaves, and that's going to help them become very successful. And in these ethnic enclaves, they're going to duplicate many of the same customs of their homelands, including language and religion. And this is known as cultural pluralism. So you could walk into a neighborhood and automatically say, "Oh man, there's a lot of Polish people here," or "There's a lot of Italian people here." And it's almost a small recreation of their homeland. And immigrants want to come up to America, but to be successful, they need to learn first and foremost English. Other things to know, they need to adapt to American culture, have some sort of marketable skill. Maybe they're a mason, or maybe they're a carpenter, or maybe later on they're an electrician. They need to have some sort of skill, or at least make some way to make money to be successful in America. And if they settle among the members of their own ethnic group, they normally tend to adjust well to living in America. Again, here's a picture of Little Italy, an example of cultural pluralism. Here's a picture of Chinatown, another example of cultural pluralism. So Asians come for a little bit different reasons than a lot of Europeans. They come to escape poverty and unemployment, famine in China. They come for a pull factor. They come to get rich from the California gold rush in 1849. They escape a civil war in China called the Taiping Rebellion. And of course, they come for railroad work when building the Transcontinental Railroad. And all this happens because of improved relations with the Chinese. The Burlingame Treaty is the first real treaty that establishes a relationship with a European-based ally. And when we say European-based, we mean, I guess, Westerners is a better way of saying that. The Chinese were historically closed off to any Western ideas. And so we are going to start relations with the Chinese. And so this is an expansion of manifest destiny and imperialism. Chinese immigrants come, they work as laborers, servants, skilled tradesmen, and other merchants. And many of them open their own businesses, like laundry businesses, small businesses on the West Coast. So here's a picture and a fact about the Taiping Rebellion, one of the biggest push factors of migration. It was a civil war in China, lasted 17 years. 20 million people died, mostly of famine and starvation. So between 1900 and 1908, a lot of Japanese also come to America. They come for a little bit different reason. They come because Japan is becoming very militaristic and they're building an industrial economy. A lot of these Japanese immigrants don't know how to survive in an industrial economy. So it's kind of the opposite of people on the Great Plains. They couldn't adjust to new forms of agriculture, so they moved to the cities. Well, these Japanese immigrants, they don't know how to work in factories, so they come to America seeking agricultural work. And many of them are going to come to the U.S. Because of these lack of agricultural jobs that are in Japan. And whether you were Japanese, Filipino, or Chinese, you came through Angel Island near San Francisco. And many times you waited here for months because of nativism. And a lot of Americans did not want Asian immigrants here. So again, a picture of Angel Island, not very welcoming, unlike Europe. And so again, this brings us back to nativism. It's an extreme dislike for foreigners by native-born people, and you want to limit immigration. Nativism first starts towards the Irish, 1840s, 1850s. And then around this time, we're talking about nativism towards Asians, Jews, and Eastern Europeans, these new immigrants. They're going to be the focus of nativism. So when we talk about new immigrants, again, these are immigrants from mostly Northern and Eastern Europe. They're not Protestant. They are mostly Jewish or Eastern Orthodox. They're not seen as hard workers. Strikes are made by many Americans. Strikes, mostly by these immigrant workers, make it most Americans afraid of immigrants. We think they're anarchists and lazy workers who are trying to ruin things for everybody. And so these immigrants settle mostly in cities. And again, these immigrants that are coming from Eastern Europe, for the most part, are blamed for many of the problems in cities. And this just fuels the nativism idea. So when they were here, eventually 25% of them actually returned to their homelands. A lot of them were kind of known as birds of passage, like a bird who goes south for the wintertime. They came over here because they felt they could make money enough to buy land in their homeland. So they would come over here, work hard, earn some money, and hopefully return back to their Eastern European homelands where the standard of living is not so high, and they could make it. So they needed sort of a jump start to make some money so they could go back. So they took advantage of America that way. Okay, many of them again tried to maintain their traditional culture. We talked about that. And so the anti-immigrant movement, this nativist movement, comes from a lot of politicians. One of the politicians was Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, and he is going to be a big member of the American Protective Association. He is going to be for what they call immigration quotas. And what an immigration quota is, it's a restriction on immigrants. They're only allowed to let a certain number of new immigrants into America. And another prime example of this, and something supported by Henry Cabot Lodge, was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So on the right here, you see a picture of an immigration quota, and here it's set at 3%. So what an immigration quota really did was it limited certain immigrants. And you would think that this 3% is fair, but what it was based on was it was based on how many people of that ethnic group were currently in America. So if the limit was 3% on everyone, that means that only 3% of new Irish immigrants can come. Only 3% of current Lithuanians who are in America can come. And the problem with that is that before the 1900s, we had a ton of Irish people here and a ton of Germans and a ton of English. And so when you say 3% of, 100,000 people or 500,000 people, that's not a big deal. But when you talk about 3% of Lithuanians from 20 years ago who came to America, and now you have a lot of Eastern Europeans who want to come, that 3% really limits immigration. So again, these are called immigration quotas. They're going to be part of the early 1900s. And then in the 1920s, they're going to be another big deal because of our fear of communism because of the Red Revolution of 1917. So again, the Chinese Exclusion Act, that's probably the biggest example of nativism. It's going to bar Chinese immigration for 10 years, but eventually it'll be passed again and passed again and passed again. And it's going to be 60 years until 1943 that the Chinese will be allowed back in the United States. So I'll give you a chance to jot that down. It's just fascinating to think about. My dad, actually, not my grandfather, my dad was alive when we were not allowing Chinese immigrants. So if you have someone in your family who's in their late 70s or 80s, they were alive when we weren't allowing Chinese immigrants into America. So it lasted a very, very long time. So we talked earlier about, immigrants moving to the cities. Well, Americans already here are going to move to the cities too. So we're going to see population increases from about 10 million in 1870 to over 30 million by 1900. Immigrants are going to remain in the cities where they work long hours for little pay, but you're also going to see farmers moving to cities for pull factors of migration. Immigrants did feel like their standard of living had improved in the United States, even though they had all these issues in factories where they work long hours, they have horrible working conditions. It was better than where they were from, so they ended up staying in America. Okay? Farmers began moving to cities because of simple things like better paying jobs. There's electricity in the city. There's running water in the city. There's indoor plumbing in the city, and there's entertainment in the city. So because of immigrants and migrants, we see a lot of growth in the cities. Okay. One of the other reasons that people who were already in America moved to the cities was amusement. Okay. Vaudeville is sort of like, talent shows. People would put on these shows. You'd see families that had special talents they would put on stage. Things like the circus, P.T. Barnum and Bailey, the greatest show on earth, that brought a lot of people to the cities. Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. So you see that these are pull factors of migration. A lot of these are not available out in the rural country. So you're going to see a shift in population from rural country to urban city. And in fact, by like 1990, I know this is going fast forward a little bit, 90% of people in America live in cities. So a big change. Other things, you're going to see Wild West shows that kind of tour the country, mostly in major cities. That's going to bring people to the cities. And baseball, America's pastime, really kind of blows up after the Civil War when it really got big. And then in the 1890s, it really got big. You had different leagues and people were coming out to go to the ballpark. And it's a nice thing to do if you can live in a big city. Okay. So again, what's happening here, it's called urbanization. People are moving from the country to the city. We go from nice green fields to growing cities. And one of the biggest things you'll see, obviously, and this is sort of a more modern picture, but they're running out of space in the cities. So they can't build out. So they end up building up. And so we get things like skyscrapers. And so we have a new urban environment. Housing, transportation needs are going to change due to the increase of amount of people in cities. We have more railroads. We have more subways. And people start to build up because the price of land is going up because they're running out of land on the ground. They have to build up. So we get skyscrapers, these giant, tall steel frame buildings, and constructed for this very reason. One of the principal architects of skyscrapers was a man named Louis Sullivan, and he's sort of the father of skyscrapers. What you see here is the first Chicago skyscraper, the Wainwright Building. And I believe the title of this picture is called Working the Steel. It's workers that are taking a break high above the ground, and it looks pretty scary to me. Okay. If you come back home locally, we talked about this on our trip downtown. Shreveport's first skyscraper was the Commercial National Bank. This is on the corner here of Texas Street. Now it's a bunch of lofts, but this was built in 1910, and it was commissioned by a man named Peter Urey. If you might know the name Urey Drive, he's the man that was responsible for getting this building built. And of course, in 1986, I was very young at the time, but they built the tallest skyscraper in Shreveport, which is Regent's Tower. So pretty cool how even little Shreveport is building up with urbanization. Here's some other Shreveport history. 1890, you're going to have Shreveport streetcars. This is at the corner of Texas and Market Streets. This is in October of 1890. We had a streetcar that ran right down the middle of the street. And of course, if you've ever been to New Orleans, they still have some of these streetcars there. In 1898, you're going to have the first subway system in the United States in Boston. It looks like it's got 4 lines there now. This is a modern map. So you're going to have also changes in where people live depending on how much money you make. So you're going to see boundaries where people live based on their wealth. The wealthy middle class and working class will be divided based on their income. Wealthy families tend to live in the heart of the city where they have elaborate homes. This isn't the case now. We don't really have elaborate homes in the heart of the city, but we do have, because of skyscrapers, we have things like penthouses. And a lot of the rich people today live in these nice penthouses. But during the time of urbanization, the center of the city had a lot of mansions in it. Okay? The middle class, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, they live in the suburbs. They live in kind of away from the city, not too far away. That's going to change, though, with the invention of the automobile in the 19 teens and 1920s. We'll move further and further out. But the middle class sort of live on the outskirts of the city. And the majority of urban dwellers, which include immigrants, like in our story, The Jungle, they live in the middle of the city. This is the working class. And they live in things called tenements. And these are dark and crowded multifamily apartments. Very horrible places to live. But again, they have no choice. They have to work these horrible conditions with horrible pay. But things are still better than where they're from. So they choose to live in these tenements. Okay? Here's an example of a tenement on the left. This is one room. As you can see, it's used for a variety of purposes. And up here on the right, what you have is a tenement building square, basically, a tenement square. And you've got, multiple tenement buildings kind of next to each other. And as you can see, pretty ingenious. Well, let's tie a clothesline between tenement buildings. Therefore, we don't have to use one of these very valuable and needed rooms for sort of a laundry room. Okay, the worst of these tenements was called a dumbbell tenement. And what it was 7 to 8 stories high, very little ventilation. They smelled, they reeked of rotted food and just the human nasty smell. And the saddest part of all is in the middle of this dumbbell tenement, there's one toilet for probably 40 people, okay, on one floor. So here's an example of a dumbbell tenement sort of layout. As you can see, this whole thing here is like one tenement, and then here's another tenement. So this is 4 families, and this thing in the middle, I assume with the X marks the spot, has got to be the toilet. So not a very nice place to live at all. And so how do we respond? Well, we're going to come back to that term muckraker. And so Jacob Riis, he himself is of immigrant stock. He comes over and he's going to write about the horrible conditions in these tenements in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And it's going to expose these problems in tenements that immigrants faced. And later on, it's going to lead to reforms in building codes and things like fire escapes, which a lot of these tenements didn't they had no way to escape a fire. So they're going to have codes in major cities that you have to have bare minimum bathrooms. You have to have bare minimum fire escapes. Having too many people living in this particular apartment is dangerous and is therefore illegal. So building codes come out and improvements for these immigrant houses in the big cities because of Jacob Riis. Okay. Other problems, some big ones. The growth of cities results in an increase in crime, fire, disease, and pollution. And also, this overcrowded also leads to increases in the murder rate. There's lots of crime during the Gilded Age in these major cities. And of course, who do we blame for all the problems? A lot of native-born Americans blame immigrants for the increase in crime. And a lot of women decide that not only immigrants are the problem, but alcohol is the problem. And that's going to help lead to prohibition. A lot of women think that alcohol is a root of all the crime in cities and the problems. And so we're going to start to see what's called the temperance movement, which is going to start to limit alcohol. Okay. Another big problem, disease, contaminated drinking water. The sewers were open sewers. So what I mean by that is there were no underground pipes that carried human waste away. What carried waste away was the street. And so the street was a river of human waste and contaminated drinking water. Of course, all this human waste goes down into the rivers. What do we use the rivers for? We use the rivers for drinking water. And so, these massive epidemics of typhoid fever and cholera because of lack of sanitation. This particular graph shows you sort of the death rate if you got an infectious disease. And so around the time period we're talking about, 1900, if out of 1,000 people, if you got an infectious disease, 800 of those 1,000 people died. So you had an 80% mortality rate if you happen to catch an infectious disease living in one of these major cities in 1900. And as you can see, it goes down. We've got a flu epidemic in like 1918 that causes some problems. But then you see stuff like penicillin introduced during World War II, and you see, of course, the mortality rate now is very, very low for infectious diseases. So changing culture, we talked about Mark Twain sort of coining the term Gilded Age from this time period from 1870 to 1900. And it's, again, important to know that it's a time of tremendous growth. Things are great economically in the industrial economy of America, but there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of poverty. There's a huge difference between rich and poor. Lots of social, economic, and political problems. So one of the things that we need to fix these problems is an increase in education. So an increase of industry results in a need for better trained workers. We need workers who know how to work the machines. If you're a farmer, we need farmers who know how to work this new technology. And so there's going to be a need for more schools and colleges. And so we get the name here for wanting to become more American. It's called Americanization. Very different than assimilation. Immigrants who come to America want to learn how to be successful in America. And so Americanization is the key to being successful. And so one of the ways that immigrants are successful is through political machines. They get help from political machines in exchange for votes. However, the other side of this is a woman and a group of people who help immigrants, and they want absolutely nothing in return. They don't want votes. They just want to help immigrants be successful in America. And so what we have is something called the Settlement House movement. And what it is, it's a place where immigrants can go to learn the English language, learn job skills, and help them adjust to life in America. When they first started out, the most successful of these settlement houses, the very first one was called Hull House. It was an old mansion that a woman by the name of Jane Addams bought, and she's going to start the Settlement House movement. Jane Addams, when she was a child, she went to London, and she saw how people lived. Her family was very rich, and she just couldn't understand how people could live in such poverty. So it changed her. She came back to America, and she dedicated her life to helping the poor. And what's really interesting about this is, it started out also as a daycare for kids, so mothers could actually go out and work because mothers needed to work. Young children as young as 10 years old wanted to work, and so mother couldn't leave her newborn child. And this is going to sound horrible, and it is horrible, but back in this time period, one of the ways that a woman could leave her child at home, if they were 3 or 4 or 5 years old, is literally tie them with a rope to like a chair or a table, and then go out and try to provide for their family. And that's horrible. And so Jane Addams is going to provide the other service of daycare for newly acquired mothers and new mothers, excuse me. So Jane Addams, she establishes Hull House, and because of her efforts in this big city of Chicago, her ideas are going to spread, and within a few years, there's over 500 settlement houses in America helping immigrants. And Jane Addams would later help found the NAACP. She would also get a Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. So here's Jane Addams here in the center, helping out immigrants. This is the most well-known settlement house. This is Hull House. This was an old mansion that she bought and turned into this settlement house for immigrants. Another woman who actually started working with Jane Addams in the settlement house movement was Frances Perkins. And she actually became the first female cabinet member. So that's kind of a cool fact about Frances Perkins. So women are helping, and women are being rewarded in political offices because of that. So how did the church respond? Well, the church responded with something called the social gospel. This is a Protestant movement, and it's the idea that it's not just being a good Christian that we need to do as good Christians, is we have to get out there and actually help the poor. And so a lot of Protestant groups are going to go out there and help the poor in these major cities in line with their religious beliefs. The Salvation Army was formed around the time of the Civil War. They're going to be a group that helps the poor in these major cities. The YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and the Young Women's Christian Association, they're going to be formed really before the Civil War. They're formed in London, England. But after the Civil War, they come over here, and we start establishing sections here in places like New York and Chicago. And so they're out there helping young people and the poor kind of adapt to American life. Another group that comes out, a little bit different, is Mary Baker Eddy. She creates something called the Christian Science movement. And how does the Christian Science movement try to help the poor? Well, not through medicine. They think that through prayer alone, that you can solve a lot of disease and problems like that in these urban problems. So, not knocking it, but that's what the Church of Christian Scientists believe. Okay, prayer can solve things, and I think it can. Hopefully, you do too. Maybe you don't. It's okay. The number of colleges also increased in the late 1800s, mostly due to something called the Morrill Land Grant Act. And what this is, one of the Morrill Grant Acts was passed in the Civil War by Lincoln. This one is giving land to states for the purposes of establishing agricultural and mechanical colleges. Agricultural and mechanical, A&M. That's right. So places like Florida A&M, Texas A&M, Arkansas A&M, these are colleges meant to help farmers adjust to new farming techniques. And so it's through the Morrill Land Grant Act that we get these agricultural colleges. And so college attendance increases and people are more educated in America. And we get some women's colleges as well. Another person very important in the educational field is a man named John Dewey, wrong Dewey. He increased support for schools, and he's sort of like the father of social studies. So a lot of social studies teachers kind of like, he's our patron saint. So he's going to focus on things like, increasing democracy and how democracy works in schools, civic mindedness, focus on journalism, things of that nature. And of course, we have Tuskegee, which was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881 in Alabama, which is the first college for African Americans. We also have new universities, and a lot of these new universities are founded by industrialists. So what we have is we have Stanford University, and Stanford was one of the people who had stock in the Central Pacific Railroad over in California, and he was able to make money off of it. And so philanthropy, he was able to give back and create Stanford University. And the golden spike that actually connected the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads is actually at Stanford University. We've got Carnegie Mellon University, obviously Carnegie, the steel magnate, and Andrew Mellon, who was a banking sort of big business guy, not quite as big as JP Morgan, but also big. And then you have the University of Chicago, which is going to be established because of the generosity of John D. Rockefeller. So we've got a lot of new universities. This is a picture of Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee. Chautauqua, I hope I'm saying that right. Chautauqua movement is a movement to help the rural parts of the country. So universities weren't really available to people out in the country. And so you had groups of people who went out to teach these rural folks about, higher levels of education. And so like down here is kind of a cool one here. Melvin Dewey, a different Dewey, Melville Dewey, he's the one who's going to establish the Dewey Decimal System. And so this is a picture of a library science class out in the country. Writing is going to increase. A lot of people are going to buy magazines. They're going to buy novels. And so it's a great thing that all this education is happening sort of during the time of mass immigration. So you have two major newspaper guys. The first one is Joseph Pulitzer, and the second one is William Randolph Hearst. And so they're really going to be most instrumental in publishing and getting a lot of viewership for their newspapers. Some of the biggest of all time. And Joseph Pulitzer especially, he's kind of an investigative journalist. He's going to expose problems in big companies like Standard Oil. And so he could be considered a muckraker. But really, these guys, what gets them to sell so many newspapers is not that they're so investigative, but because of something called yellow journalism. And William Randolph Hearst is really the worst at this. Yellow journalism is extreme, sensational newspaper writing. Okay, so think about those tabloid magazines that you see, in the checkout line at Kroger or Brookshire's or wherever you shop. This is yellow journalism. They have these eye-catching headlines, which really get you to go, wait, what? And you buy the magazine, and inside you hear these sensational stories about what's happening in Standard Oil and what's happening with the meatpacking plants in Chicago. And so a lot of it is investigative, but a lot of it also is straight up hyperbole. But it is important to see that Americans are reading, whether it's exaggerated or not. Okay. Other things, you're going to have people buying these dime novels, which are cheap novels, and one of the reasons is they can read. So obviously they're going to buy more reading material. But also think of the Gilded Age as this time of social problems. So even immigrants are picking up these escapism themed novels. And so they're a way to escape your horrible living conditions. So things like the Wild Wild West are in these novels. So you're going to have paperbacks for the first time, more available for people. And of course, Horatio Alger is one of the people who really pulls a lot of immigrants here in the first place and keeps immigrants here because of his idea of rags to riches stories, which really weren't true for the most part, but they did give immigrants and the poor hope that things would improve during this Gilded Age. And that's it. Thank you.